Okay, well, I make it that it is now 15:15, so let us get started. Um, so thank you very much all for being here.
Sure.
And I just wanted to, oh, I should have announced this before. We are recording this meeting. It's not, well, I don't know if we would put some extracts of it onto the library's YouTube channel or anything, but if anyone has any concerns about that, you can please let me know. Um, or you can let me know afterwards. But anyway, we are recording. I wanted to make that clear because it does show up in the top left of the screen, but it's not terribly obvious. And then I also wanted to mention, we already talked about this, how to get into gallery view or speaker view in Zoom. I'm sure everyone's done a ton of Zoom meetings recently, but it's up to the top right. There's a little set of icons, and if you click on it, you can move between speaker view or gallery view, and that way you can see everyone in boxes covering the whole screen, or else when the speakers are presenting, I suggest that you might want to go into speaker view so that you can kind of focus on them. And we'll also be sharing the screen and showing some presentations while the speakers are talking. So it was my honor to be elected president of the Friends of the Altadena Library almost exactly 1 year ago. And so much has happened since then. In 2019, in response to an overwhelming number of book donations received by the Friends each year, we decided to move from holding one big annual book sale every May to holding 3 big book sales each year. And of course, as it turned out, this was fortuitous timing to make that change, because it meant that we had already run 2 big book sales in September and February before the lockdown hit. So those sales, in addition to our regular sale at the Christmas Tree Lane Festival in December, were hugely successful and are part of the reason that we will still be donating $28,000 to the library this year. So we owe a huge thanks,
Yes.
as always,
Good.
to the Friends book sorters who sort, clean, and box up all of the donated books, as well as to the dozens of volunteers who come out to help at our big book sales and other big events. And we also owe our thanks to the library, especially former volunteer coordinator Uni LaFontaine, its facilities manager Jonathan Arevalo, and the library director Nikki Winslow for being so supportive of these efforts, and even allowing us to hold our big February sale inside the library due to the threat of rain. And of course, we also owe our huge thanks to those who came out to buy books. So to all those of you who purchased books at the book sale, thank you. However, we also receive a huge amount of income from the Friends bookstore in the main library and from sales of more valuable books online via the last bookstore. So it would be very remiss of me not to give special thanks to the small cadre of volunteers who give up hours each week to make sure that the bookstore is always fully stocked. And should especially mention Phyllis Paris and Kathy Mahaffey, who are at the library virtually every day and are the first points of contact for nearly every donated book. And this past year has also been very busy in terms of library programs and events. The Friends have continued to support many of the library's programs, including Literacy in ESL, the Connect newsletter, parent workshops, and Readadena. And in addition, we supported the Second Saturday and Summer Movie Night series. I can hear some noise. I forgot to ask people if they could mute their microphones if they're not speaking. Sorry about that. So anyway, we've supported Literacy and ESL, Connect, like newsletter, parent workshops, and Readadena. In addition, we supported the Second Saturday and Summer Movie Night series. We sponsored the very popular new series of chamber music concerts by the Mount Low Chamber Players. And we also supported the Poetry and Cookies program, which, despite the lockdown, culminated in a fantastic 2-hour virtual event at the end of April. Last November saw a very special event as the Friends marked our 60th anniversary. We celebrated with our first ever book pitch party, at which 16 people, and there are several of them on the call, pitched their favorite book to a large audience. And the genres were wide-ranging, from biographies to science fiction, while topics range from a novel about a young slave who is a brilliant artist to a picture book in which a small dog tells tales of underdogs through history. And we plan to hold a virtual book pitch party again in July, and we look forward to another wonderful spread of tragic, uplifting, and entertaining stories. So I want to end by saying something about the purpose of the Friends, which is of course to support the Altadena Library District. And part of that involves fundraising to support library activities and running events that celebrate stories and learning. It also means supporting what the library stands for and being a voice of the library in the community, as well as providing a way for members of the Altadena community to have a voice in what their library is doing. The impact of COVID-19 has shown us the importance of the library as a focal point in our community. The Altadena News website, established by the Library and Town Council, has provided both important information and a much needed sense of solidarity in this period, during which most of us have been faced with great challenges, and some of us have had to deal with the illness or even the loss of a friend or family member under the most difficult of conditions. The library's commitment to providing online resources and now a safe curbside pickup service for checking out physical items has also provided support to hundreds, if not thousands, of library users. Going forward, the library has plans to open up safely for all staff, volunteers, and patrons. The Friends have made this year's donation to the library very flexible in terms of what it will fund, with emphasis on supporting social distancing requirements, such as providing laptops that might be used in the library grounds, or more Wi-Fi hotspots that may be checked out to provide patrons with internet at home. In the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd, the violence and other abuses faced by so many before him, and the resounding call to action now echoing through our country, the library and its two support groups, the Friends and the Altadena Library Foundation, have committed to addressing the systemic racism in our communities. The library has formed an equity, diversity, and inclusion team and welcomes more involvement in this effort from those who have experienced oppression of any kind, whether due to race, sex, sexual orientation, or disability. The team will ensure that our words of solidarity are transformed into real action, such as reviewing hiring practices and providing anti-racism and LGBTQ+ resources. The Friends intend to support this by supporting more speakers, panel events, and community discussions that can spur real change to occur in a number of intersecting areas, from tackling the blatant racism so often prevalent in our communities and our leaders, to addressing the growing poverty gap and the rise of homelessness. We thus hope that today's speaker meeting will be only the first of many events at the Altadena Library that address such issues. So once again, thank you so much for attending, and we're very happy to have you all here. Okay, so now I hope we have all of our nominees on the line, but I believe we do. We'll now have our Friends election. So the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to ask people to vote in the chat window. And those who are eligible to vote are anyone who is a member of the Friends, and that means anybody who is either a lifetime member or who joined since last October. So if you were a lifetime member of the Friends or joined since last October, you are eligible to vote. And the Friends Nominating Committee, of which I'm a representative, has proposed a slate of offices that includes Marnie Brown as president. Give us a wave, Marnie. Joy Strayer as vice president. Joy, can you wave? Jeanette Allen as treasurer. Where is Jeanette? There's Jeanette. And Sally Cruz as secretary. There's Sally. Okay. All of those nominated have agreed to serve. So is there a motion to accept the nominating committee's recommendation?
So moved.
Okay, thank you, Dave. And is there a second?
Second.
I think Marilyn has seconded. Thank you, Marilyn. Now, would anyone like to discuss the nominees? I know they look like a shady bunch, but I would just like to say that all of the nominees, as most of you know, are dedicated Friends board members. I think both Marnie and Sally have previously acted as full president. That's correct, isn't it? Yes. And Joy and Jeanette are currently our vice president and treasurer, respectively. And we have been very, very lucky to have all of them involved with the Friends for so many years. So would anyone else like to say anything? All right. So if there's no further discussion, I would like to call for a vote. So as I said, if you are a member of the Friends, we would ask you to write your name and your vote in the chat area of the meeting. And that is accessed by clicking the chat button down below. and then it will appear on the right. And so obviously it's yes to accept the nominating committee's recommendation. Oh, and please write your name. Or actually, I guess it will show up as,
Claire?
the name will show up. Yes, Dave?
Do you want the chat to be addressed just to you or to everybody?
Everybody, it's up to you guys. I will save it either way.
Well,
So
if it's everybody, then, I mean, not that it matters, but everyone will know how everyone voted.
yeah, I figured it's usually public anyway because we're all sticking our hands up in a room. But so
Sure.
either way is wonderful. So and obviously you're free to abstain or vote no as you choose. But I
think, Claire, that on my chat it's only going to go to you privately. I don't seem to have the option of saying to everybody. So
okay.
Everybody. So that may be what the issue is. So
that makes it easier then, I guess.
There's no other option. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. That's true.
I think that's because I set it up. I was paranoid about Zoom bombings, and so I set every precaution I could think of. So let me say. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Oh, I do as well. 12. I obviously vote. Yeah, I'm going to share my vote anyway. 12, 13. I think that's 14. Actually, that's 14 and 15. Yes, because there were 2. So okay, we have the slate of nominees have been elected to their position. So thank you, everybody. Phew.
Good job.
Congratulations, everyone.
Well done.
And that's great. So oh gosh, where did that go? All right, so now we are into the speaker portion of the meeting before I accidentally close it and end the meeting by mistake. And I will now hand over to our president-elect, Marnie Brown, to introduce the speakers and take it from here.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for your service this last year. You've set a new standard, a new bar in technological enhancements here. So I only hope I can live up to this in the coming year. So it's going to be tough. The last few years we've had some excellent presidents. So you've both you and Mark, who was there before you, have both really set a new bar. So as Claire mentioned, our donation this year is $28,000. I'd like to thank the friends who have donated this year, and we're going to virtually hand an envelope to the library now. And so I am looking for that.
Jeanette showing the check.
Showing the check, our 28,000 donation. She's putting it in an envelope, which she is passing off to me virtually. And wait, there it is. And I will pass this off to Nikki virtually. Hopefully Nikki can see it. Well, Nikki may be able to see it, or I'll pass it to Stella. Stella, you can take the envelope.
There we go. And it's become invisible. So wonderful. Well done, everyone.
Hi, Nikki.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, yes, we will be giving $28,000, and it's only through memberships and donations and the hard work of the many committees that we've had that we've been able to do that. So I have notes. I had a script. Thank you, Claire. I had a script. So yes, we're joined today by Nikki Winslow, the library's director and public services director at Stella Terrassa, to accept the library's donation on the Friends' behalf to the library. Now I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. Our guests are Tim DeRoche, who's the author of the very recently published book, A Fine Line: How Most American Kids Are Kept Out of the Best Public Schools. Tim is a consultant and writer based in Los Angeles and has worked with clients in K-12 education, serving public school districts, charter school networks, and other nonprofits. He has also written and executive produced the children's science series Grandpa's Garage, as well as writing and directing several short films. Tim's first book, The Ballad of Huck and Miguel, a retelling of the Huck Finn tale set on the Los Angeles River, illustrated by Daniel Gonzalez, was Pasadena Library's One City, One Story summer selection last year in 2019. Tim is joined today by former state senator and education reform advocate Gloria Romero, who wrote the afterword of A Fine Line. Gloria was the first woman to ever hold the position of Senate Majority Leader in the California Senate. She also served as chair of the Senate Education Committee, during which time she authored the Parent Open Empowerment Act, which transfers rights to parents of children in chronically underperforming schools. Gloria is also the founder and executive director of Scholarship Prep Charter School in Santa Ana, a county-wide benefit school focused on closing the achievement gap for high poverty and foster youth. So welcome, Tim and Gloria. We're honored to have you here. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, oh, we can't hear you, Tim. I think Tim said they had a power outage. He just had to reconnect.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to Marnie. Thank you to Claire for setting this up. We're honored to be here and to talk to you guys. And yes, the power went out during your voting process, and I'm running around. And for a second there, it seemed like the internet was going to be down, but it's back up. So I'm off the cellular network, which will be better. What I thought we'd do first is, Claire, do you want to start with the video, and then I can talk a little bit and then hand it off to Gloria? Why don't we start with our book trailer, which sort of explains what our book is about. And I was
also going to say, if people would like to switch to speaker view while Tim and Gloria are speaking, then they'll be able to see. I don't think everyone needs to turn their video off. They might want to have some reaction from the audience, but what do you think, Tim and Gloria? Are you happy for people to leave their videos on, or would you like them
I'm fine. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. It's nice to see a crowd here.
Yeah, and so I will. So I've turned it on to speaker view. So again, that's up to the top, and you click on that, and then you should be able to see a big picture of Tim. But I will first begin by sharing. By sharing the video, which I need to bring up before I can share it. So here we go in 3, 2, 1.
Great.
A person's zip code shouldn't determine their educational destiny. I'm Tim DeRoche. I'm the author of A Fine Line, How Most American Kids Are Kept Out of the Best Public Schools. The book is really about these policies that assign children to schools based on where they live. And specifically, I'm shining a light on attendance zones, which are the lines drawn by a district that determine who goes to which school and who gets preferential enrollment at the best public schools.
To me, this book goes to really the essence, the heart of what I saw as a policymaker, as a legislator in Sacramento. It helps us to connect the dots. This is a very exciting hearing for the Senate Education Committee. I'm retired California State Senator Gloria Romero. I was actually the very first woman to ever achieve the leadership position, being elected to be the majority leader. And also I was on the Education Committee for most of the 14 years that I served.
Gloria Romero is a hero of mine. I was so honored when she agreed to write the afterword to the book. She fought for kids when she was in the Senate. She was always willing to speak truth to power.
Is it right to have these artificial lines drawn by some unidentified bureaucrat that this is the front door through which you can enter, or this is a door that says closed and you must go elsewhere?
Most people have heard of district boundaries, legislatively determined boundaries of a school district. But what plays an outsized role in most American families' lives are these attendance zones, which are the lines drawn by the district staff showing which kids are directed to which schools. And these lines really only have meaning for the best schools. It keeps the population of that school separate from the broader community of the district.
These lines have existed for decades in our state, in our nation, and it's about time that there is a spotlight on these little fine lines that people never see, but really become determinants of who gets a high quality education and who's prevented.
Redlining was a practice during the 1930s, during the New Deal era. The government drew these maps showing who was or wasn't eligible for federal housing assistance. And so they would shade certain areas of the city green or blue, meaning that those areas were desirable and those people could get housing assistance. And then they shaded other areas of the city red or yellow. Those areas were not eligible for housing assistance. The government used the map to discriminate against people who lived in those areas. And what we found was that in many cases, the outline of the attendance zone kind of mirrors the shape of the desirable area from the redlining map from 80 years ago. This is really something that happens across the country.
I believe that when readers pick up this book, that they will have this aha moment. There's so much that needs to be done to really change the system. But the first one is awareness.
You can talk to parents of all different income levels who've had their lives affected by these policies. Poor minority parents who've been excluded from these elite public schools in the cities. Middle income parents who had to sell the home where they raised their kids. Wealthy parents in Malibu paid a friend for their utility bill. It's really extraordinary the lengths that people will go to navigate these policies.
Have the courage to read this book and to understand that this is an opportunity. It's long past time to erase those lines. It's long past time to recognize them and dismantle them the same way we've taken on political gerrymandering and banking redlining. We've got to take on education redlining for every family that wants to have access to the American dream.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was great. Just want to say again how honored we are to be here to talk to you all. My wife, actually, we have lots of connections to Altadena. My wife grew up in Altadena in her elementary years, went to elementary school in Altadena, and her brother lives up there now with his family. So we spend a lot of time up around you guys, and then obviously had our connection to the Pasadena Public Library last year when my book was selected as their One City, One Story. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. So this book got its start a few years ago. Gloria had left the Senate and was heading the local chapter of Democrats for Education Reform. And I was hired to help her think through kind of her plan post after the legislature. And the first time we got together, we had coffee at a Starbucks in El Sereno. And Gloria was in the midst of giving these very passionate, she was out talking in the community and giving these very passionate speeches about how your zip code should not determine your destiny, and kids should not be assigned to kids shouldn't be sorted into winners and losers when they're 5 years old, right? And I found that resonated with me, and Gloria and I were certainly aligned on that, but Gloria was speaking about it in a way that I hadn't heard anyone speak about it before, and she was honestly looking the issue squarely in the eye. And during that meeting, it somehow came up. We started wondering what was the legal basis for kids to be excluded from these district schools if they're residents of the district. So, for example, I had been living in Silver Lake, and there's a very coveted school there called Ivanhoe. And everyone knows that Ivanhoe is coveted. Everybody knows that people try to buy within the zone. But I knew a little bit about the LA Unified School District, and I knew that the district itself is rather large. And so the kids who are on the outside of the zone, like what if they were to show up at Ivanhoe? Gloria and I started wondering, well, what is the legal basis for the school saying, no, we're going to turn you away? And so that's really where it started. So I want to turn it over here to Gloria. I'm going to walk you guys through some of the exhibits in the book and some of the things that we found. You know, Gloria and I had been working in ed reform for 20 years separately before this, off and on. And so we had some knowledge, but really the research for this book, it was surprise after surprise after surprise. And so I want to share a little bit of that with you and walk you through some of the exhibits and the research that we completed. But I'd love to start with Gloria's perspective and have her talk a little bit about what she's seen in the history of educational inequality and inequality of opportunity in the state, dating back decades. Gloria?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you so much, friends of the Altadena Library. It really is an honor to be with you today. We wish we could have been in person, but this is, I suppose, the next best thing. So thank you for having me. You noticed on the flyer that went out, there was an acknowledgement, because we had originally picked that date, actually, to really jumpstart this conversation, and that was the anniversary of the passage, the enactment of Brown versus Board of Education. That was 66 years ago. And I want us to just stop and think about it. 66 years. How many children across the country have gone through a public school system where 66 years previous to that, there had been a declaration that separate is not equal, and that with all deliberate speed, all the little Linda Browns of the world should be able to go into a school setting that does not discriminate on the basis of race. So fast forward to today, 66 years later, and of course, we look at a lot of race disparity very differently now, and there are laws by which we can sue if there's something as blatant as saying you cannot walk through the front door of the schoolhouse dependent upon your on your skin color. It's much more sophisticated. It's much more devious, and the power of Tim's book is that he really he puts a magnifying glass on the brand new perimeters, the brand new lines, the brand new ways that have always existed, quite frankly, but the new ways by which we understand how today's Linda Browns still do not walk through the front door of a high quality school. So let's walk through. I want to just maybe talk for about 5-10 minutes just to give you a little bit of an overview, then I'll turn it back to Tim. But, we oftentimes say, and I fundamentally believe that education is the key to the American dream. I've repeated that over and over. I know my mother, who had a 6th grade level of education, all she wanted from her children, there were 6 of us, was for each of us to access education, because we knew that through education, this is what lifts you out of poverty. It's what gives you a fighting chance. It was true for me as a little girl. It's true for all the little children that I see going into schoolhouses every day across California and the nation. But what's curious is we talk about the keys to the American dream, but what if we stop to look at it and to suddenly discover that the keys that are distributed, they don't unlock the same doors. That children are sorted depending upon the key you get. That allows you to enter through the prime door, curtain number 1, or versus go through a side door or a back door or a door through which there are distinguishable and deleterious educational outcomes. What's interesting is if we stop and think about it, 66 years later, Brown v. Board of Education, we actually find that today, in fact, California is actually more segregated than what it was 66 years ago. If we look at the academic outcomes, the proficiency rates in mathematics or English language arts, just looking at English language arts, it's only 50%. And this is across all students. Although again, too, it it's worse when you start adding in high poverty and students of color. But 50%, 1 of 2 students, is not at a proficient level in English language arts. It's even worse when it comes to mathematics. And if you can't do math, how can you ever dream of being a doctor or, you know, going to the moon with Elon Musk, right? So it matters to us. And these statistics have not fundamentally changed, despite the fact that almost half of the California budget is devoted to education. So we'll kind of want to wrap our head a little bit about that. So fast forward, how did I get into this? I told you my mother had a 6th grade level of education. We believed in education. I was fortunate. I was able to go to college on scholarships, graduated, loved learning, became a professor. I was teaching at Cal State LA, and I started noticing that too many, I call them kids, but too many of my students from just across the freeway. And probably most of you know the location of Cal State LA. It's right there, right off the 10 freeway, bordered by the 710. Most of the kids coming from East LA, the east side of Los Angeles, first of all, they weren't even getting across the freeway to the university. And then when they did come, quite frankly, they couldn't write. They could barely read. I would see my athletes who would perform and make money for the school in basketball on, you know, the weekends, but they were struggling in my classroom. And so I started really to look at this. And ultimately on the campaign, the platform of education, the need for greater literacy, I ran for the California State Assembly, and subsequent to that, the California State Senate. And I was the professor who was talking about education access and what's happening in the K through 12 system, where kids are doing everything right. They're graduating, they're being forwarded, they're being passed on, but they get to a college classroom and suddenly they are in remedial education. They can't read, they can't write. What is happening here? So I had 2 major assignments as a senator. I was on the education committee for most of the time and ended my career having become the chair of the education committee. And at the same time, I was the chair basically of the prison reform committee. So I've been in every prison in California for nothing that I've done. Okay, but I started looking at it and realizing that, you know, education and prisons, these are flip sides of the same coin. If we do not educate, we will incarcerate. 70% of inmates in California prisons today do not have a high school diploma. Now, I believe in personal responsibility, but you have to look at the statistics. 70% without a high school diploma. So as a senator and looking at education, I started trying to plow through, why is this happening? Remembering my students, thinking, and I would start looking at all the bureaucracies. California, Sacramento Department of Education has got a bevy of reports. Any kind of report you want, you can get it. And I started plowing through these, and I started seeing lists, I mean, long lists of schools. These would be hundreds of schools representing thousands of students in California that would be on this list of basically underperforming schools in California. I just call them failing schools because that's what they were. And I want us to stop and think for a moment as well too, when we start looking at the importance of lines, it's not just about the student. These are again too some systemic practices which also involve the funding of schools, the boundaries that Tim is going to talk about, the teachers' contracts that make it possible for teachers to choose in which environment, which good school they want to go to, bypassing some of the quote unquote bad schools where the best teachers are really needed to close those achievement gaps and move education forward. So I started looking at a lot of the lists and seeing the rates. And one of the things that I really became aware of was the power of the boundary, the power of zip code. I called it 5 digits of separation. And with Tim's book, it gets even more refined. Depending upon your zip code, that is basically a fast track to what kind of a school you want to be in. And Tim mentioned in the intro that this is where, if you talk to any realtor in the state of California, across the nation, they will identify for you. This neighborhood has good schools. This neighborhood you want to avoid. And it typically comes down to money. How much money do you have? We buy our ways into a good setting. I know we've been talking about this varsity Operation Blues, this whole scandal at USC and parents buying their ways in. Well, the rich can afford it. But what about for just ordinary families? And the power of this book is that it shows this is not just about brown and black and poor kids. This is about middle America. This is about every family being affected by zip code. So it affects all of us. Some maybe more so negatively, but it affects every family. So you basically have to buy your way into a zip code. And I want you to stop and think for a moment, where else in American life are you stopped at the front door and asked for your zip code? I mean, you can worship at the church or the temple of your choice. You can go to any park in California. You can go to a dentist, you can go to a doctor, you can go to a shopping mall. In education, you can apply to any university. You can, if for childcare, you can go to any childcare center. Community colleges have made big changes, which we'll talk about after Tim speaks a little bit more. You can go to any community college. It's only in K through 12 public education where the door is slammed shut, starting with the zip code and then the fine lines that Tim identifies, where if you do not reside within that fine line, basically, you are given a different set of keys. And the important thing to think about is that nobody knows about this really. You're just told, this is the neighborhood school. And most of us go. We take our little lunch pails with us. We go, mom and daddy says goodbye to us. We get picked up later. We have very little information. What Tim is going to talk about and what the power of this book describes is somebody drew these lines. And we're going to find that it's an unidentified, unnamed bureaucrat, quite frankly, that nobody knows, nobody's ever met, who has chosen which kids are going to go to the better schools and which kids, quite frankly, just aren't going to get the golden key, and you will suffer more so in terms of a disparate outcome. Tim talked about redlining. And he'll talk about how the lines very much even mirror the housing redlining that today we recognize is illegal. You can't do that anymore. Banks can't do redlining either. You give loans, not dependent upon areas of where you live. There's been reforms even in insurance reform, fighting about zip code. But where this remains is education, and only in K through 12, what I would argue are the most important, formative. They provide the foundation years for a kid to go forward. Just in closing, before I turn this over back to Tim, make no doubt about it, in the book you'll find examples of this. Parents have been arrested and have actually gone to jail for trying to bypass these fine lines. It's almost an underground railroad once again. And we will find parents like Kelly Ballard Williams, who I call the Rosa Parks of the anti-zip code education reform movement, who actually was imprisoned in the state of Ohio for quote unquote stealing a public education. It took people to develop an online petition to free her. Then Governor Casey from Ohio actually allowed her, pardoned her. She still had to report on parole. She actually went to jail. Parents like Hamlet, again too, Mr. Garcia in the city of brotherly love in Philadelphia, Montgomery County, where he, his wife, his father-in-law were arrested. Mr. Garcia was threatened with 7 years in prison for daring to have his daughter go to a higher performing school district after he and his wife separated. These are crazy but true stories. So, because parents do understand what it means. You know, parents aren't dumb. They know that school, something good happens. This one, not so good. And so there is a movement. And my hope is with today's conversation, we don't have to keep making criminals out of parents, and you don't have to have won the lottery and be super rich to be able to afford to buy into or bribe your way into a better school. But with Tim's analysis and looking at this, really the answer 66 years after Brown v. Board of Education, really, we believe the new challenges before us if we're courageous enough to take it on. So I'm going to turn it back to Tim, who's going to tell you a really exciting, incredible story about the power of lines and what we can do to begin to expose these, be aware of these, and then maybe begin to erase them once again, 66 years after Brown v. Board. Tim?
Thank you so much, Gloria. Very, very helpful setting these issues up in the historical and political perspective. Gloria mentioned the Brown v. Board of Ed ruling, where the court basically said that you can't exclude people from schools based on their race. I think that's a particularly good frame for this issue, because that the core ruling in that decision was that when the state undertakes to provide public education, it must provide, it must make that education available, quote unquote, available to all on equal terms. And so what I want to talk about in the next few minutes is whether or not our current system of allocating spots in schools truly makes those spots, especially the spots in the best schools, available to all on equal terms. And I don't think that it does. And I think this is a particularly good time for us to be talking about this issue, given the recent protests, the riots, the unrest. You know, we've all known in the past few years that the social compact in America is growing fractured in some ways. There are flaws exposed in that social compact, and I think there are definitely things around police behavior and police accountability, especially, and the way that police unions protect officers. I think there are lots of issues around that, and lots of reform needed. But I do think it's fair to point out that public education is meant to be the great equalizer. That's Horace Mann, the founder of the Common School movement, said that public education was the great equalizer. It's meant, we live in a society in which you're mainly free, and part of that means that people need to be given, those who are less privileged need to be given the tools to access the American dream. And for many, and our country has done that for many, many people over the years, many immigrants, many minorities, many folks of all races. But I do think that there are ways in which the social compact is broken right now, and in which the promise of public education is not doing what it's supposed to in our society. So let's take a look. Let's just dive in here. Claire, could you put up the first exhibit? So what Claire is showing right now, this is a map from Chicago, from the Lincoln Park and Old Town neighborhoods of Chicago. My book is really focused on these school pairs across the country, where you have one school that is thriving and one school that is failing, and they're right next to each other. And I was interested in this because I see it happening in Los Angeles. I saw it when I lived in Silver Lake around Ivanhoe Elementary. Right now, my family and I live in Mount Washington, and you see it around Mount Washington Elementary. And I was curious whether or not this was a national issue or whether it was unique to Los Angeles. And so I started digging around, and very quickly, this example popped out as a particularly egregious example. So these are two schools. You can see Lincoln Elementary at the top, the white square, and you can see Manier Elementary at the bottom. And you can see that the zones overlap. The dividing line is North Avenue. So that kind of checkerboard pattern shows North Avenue, and for about 2/3 of a mile, if you're on one side of the street, you are zoned to go to Lincoln Elementary. You're allowed to enroll there. And if you're on the other side, you're assigned to Manier Elementary. So let's talk about those two schools. Lincoln Elementary is one of the shining stars of the Chicago Public Schools. They advertise it all over the place. Over 80% of the students at Lincoln, over 80% of the students at Lincoln are proficient in reading. And if you and people will pay, if you talk to folks in Old Town and Lincoln Park, people will pay for, you know, $200,000, $250,000 extra to live on one side of the street versus the other to make sure they're in the right zone for the equivalent house, right? And so it's a very, very coveted school. Manier Elementary, on the other hand, is a very, very troubled school. In 2019, not a single graduating eighth grader from Manier tested proficient in reading. So this is a particularly egregious example of how an attendance zone boundary keeps these two populations separate. And many folks have said to me, well, it's not about the school, right? It's the kids. And it's the families, and obviously the families who highly value education are moving in, you know, privileged families who highly value education, who probably, you know, their parents probably have college degrees. They're moving into that zone. And to some degree that may be true, but I want to point out that I went onto Google and I found 2 healthcare clinics in this neighborhood, right? One healthcare clinic that is north of North Avenue and one that is south of North Avenue. And if you look at the performance of those health clinics, both of those health clinics get positive ratings, right? Their ratings are very, very similar because there's no ability for those health clinics to discriminate on it based on who goes there. So they can't keep populations separate. People freely go cross over North Avenue, going north or south all the time to go to health clinics. They go north and south all the time to go to restaurants. They cross North Avenue all the time to, go to church. And so there's a constant mixing, and the demographics of those two schools are very different. But for the health clinics, the demographics of the health clinics on, you know, a couple blocks north and a couple blocks south, those are similar demographics and they perform equally well. What keeps the two schools separate is that attendance zone boundary. So if you call up Lincoln Elementary, as I did, doing a bit of minor league gonzo journalism, I called up Lincoln Elementary and I said, hey, my family's thinking about moving to Chicago. I hear great things about Lincoln. How can I get my kid in there? They're very honest. You have to buy a house or pay for an apartment within that zone. And you're going to pay extra, and you're going to have to show up with proof. So the dynamics of how this plays out over time, this is a particularly good example because a few years ago, about 10 years ago, what happened to Lincoln happened to several schools around the country, of these several elite schools like this. What you see is young families crowding into that zone. And over time, the housing prices go up and the school gets fuller and fuller and fuller. And what happened in this neighborhood of Chicago, there was an effort, something had to be done because Lincoln could not serve all the students in that zone. So you would think in a fair system, you'd think that, oh, the Chicago Public Schools would go around and they'd redraw the lines to address where the demographics have changed and reassign kids and draw the lines to make sure that the kids would be equally distributed amongst the schools. Well, that came up as a possibility, but it didn't happen. What happened was the families in the Lincoln zone went above the head of Chicago Public Schools, this is when Rahm Emanuel, the Democratic mayor, was in charge of the city. They went over his head, went to the state legislature, and got $20 million. $20 million to build an addition onto Lincoln so that all those families that live kind of closer to Menier, right, wouldn't be rezoned to Menier and other schools like it. And the schools around Lincoln, they all have spaces, right? Menier has hundreds of spaces, right? So basically the school system has plenty of seats to serve the number of students within the boundaries, but they're building a $20 million addition, or they did build a $20 million addition, in order that those families wouldn't be reassigned to a different school. And what I'd like to point out is that Menier has been failing for decades, right? They could have renovated Lincoln 30 years ago to provide more space and open up that school to folks south of North Avenue who were really trapped in a failing school. But nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to renovate Lincoln to add more space for those kids. But once once there was this threat of being rezoned, so one of the things you see is that these lines become calcified over time, and that they lead to more racial and socioeconomic divisions in the neighborhood over time. In LA, these lines just become hardened over time because people are buying into the zone, and so they will fight tooth and nail to prevent those lines from being moved, even if it would make the most sense in terms of the allocation of kids. So I hope that's clear. So the book is really built around these pairs of schools. So there are examples like this in Philadelphia. We have several examples from Los Angeles. We have a couple examples from New York City, an example from Atlanta, an example from Dallas, an example from Seattle. This is not a red state versus blue state problem. This is a national problem. So let's take a look now. I want to show you what we found about the correlations with redlining. So Claire, maybe you could bring up the redlining animation of Ivanhoe. All right, so don't quite play it yet. Pause it for a second. So what you're seeing here is an old redlining map of the city of Los Angeles. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with redlining. Redlining got its start in the 1930s. In the New Deal era, the federal government was passing all of these programs of housing assistance, and the federal government needed to decide who was eligible or ineligible to receive housing assistance. So a government agency started drawing these maps. And what you can see is that here now. Why don't you? So this is the map from, I think it's from 1937 or 38 of the Los Angeles area. Claire, you can hit play now. So what you'll see is that it's color coded, right? So the blue and the green areas are the quote unquote desirable areas, right? So these are the areas where they decided that the geographic area, or perhaps the residents within it, were desirable. So, okay, can you hit pause? Can you go back and just show that? Yeah. So take a look at this. So these are the green and blue areas, the desirable areas. You can see there aren't that many desirable areas, right? The federal government decided that most of the city of Los Angeles was not so desirable. And they put in place these policies where the folks in these red or these blue and green areas were eligible for housing assistance and federal mortgages, and those outside were not. So let's keep going, and we'll show you the other. All right, so pause it there. So this is what you're seeing. These are the red, pink and red, which are declining or quote unquote hazardous areas of town. And the federal government, again, making these judgments about our city and about the residents of our city and who was eligible for aid and who was not. And you know, you can imagine these areas typically covered neighborhoods where there were significant populations of minorities and immigrants. So it's the vast bulk of the city. So let's zoom in here and we'll look at Silver Lake. So this was one of the revelatory moments of research for the book. I'd been talking about these lines and talking about the analogy with redlining. At a certain point, I said, well, let's look. Let's look. What do these zones look like compared to the redlining maps? So now we're gonna. Okay, you can hit pause. So this is the Silver Lake area of Los Angeles, as shown on the redlining map from the 30s. The red dot indicates Ivanhoe Elementary, which is one of the most sought after, coveted schools in LA Unified. And the black line, as you're seeing, the black checkerboard line, shows the attendance zone. So let's let it play out here. So what you're seeing here is the shape of the attendance zone. And now we're going to fade in. Okay, now, just a second. Let's let it fade in a little bit more. Yeah, there, stop there. Go back just a second. Go back a second. Yeah, so what you can see is that the shape of the attendance zone really mirrors to some degree the shape of the quote unquote desirable area of Silver Lake from the 30s. So it's kind of extraordinary to see, right? I mean, these are maps that are almost 90 years old, almost a century old. And in some cases, the attendance zone still reflects the shape of that area. So let's show the rest of the video, Claire. And then what you can see is that the areas outside of the attendance zone are the red and yellow areas from the map in the 1930s, the areas that were designated as hazardous or declining by the federal government. And if you look at the, can you pause it, Claire? Go back maybe right before we start. Yeah, pause it there for a second. So if you look at the demographics of Ivanhoe today, the schools from the red and yellow areas that surround Ivanhoe are all majority minority with significant populations of immigrants. And Ivanhoe itself, I think, is 65 or 75% white. So in some ways, the attendance zone is now doing the job that the redlining map did 80 to 90 years ago. And you can see, you could hit, well, we'll come back to that in a second. We found several of these elite schools where the shape of the attendance zone matches the redlining map from 80 or 90 years ago. So maybe we can bring up Brooklyn. Claire, could you bring up, so what I'm going to show you is a shot from Brooklyn just to show that this is not unique to Los Angeles. So this is, what Claire's going to bring up is an attendance zone from Brooklyn of an elite public school called PS8 Robert Fulton. Very, very similar dynamic to Lincoln Elementary in Chicago or to Ivanhoe Elementary in Los Angeles or Mount Washington Elementary in Los Angeles. And you can see here, it's not exact, but the checkerboard pattern shows the shape of the current modern day attendance zone. The blue area was the desirable area back in the day, and the red areas indicate the areas that were judged to be hazardous by the federal government. So they are still excluded. And if you look at the at the demographics of PS8, you see that PS8 has a majority of white students, and the outlying schools that surround it and that are on the opposite side of the attendance zone boundary are the schools with heavy populations of immigrants and minorities. And then we can also show Dallas. So same thing here. The white areas are the parts of the city that were not developed back in the day. so they didn't get a color back in the 30s, but you can see that the border between the blue and the yellow areas is almost exactly where Dallas draws its line for, this is for prestigious Lakewood Elementary in Dallas. This is another school where they ran out of space because people were cramming into the zone, and there were schools within walking distance of many of the homes in this area that had hundreds of available seats, but due to political pressure, the district caved and spent $15 million to build more space at Lakewood to serve those parents, to serve those families, instead of allowing other kids in, or instead of allowing some of those families to go to other schools in the area. So what I don't want to say, Claire, could you go back and put up the Chicago map? So it's not true. This redlining. What are you saying, Claire?
Where was
the Chicago, the Lincoln and Meniere map?
Okay.
Let's go back to that one for a second. So it's not true. This redlining analogy in terms of the shape of the map is not true in every city. It's not true of every elite public school in America's big cities. So for example, in Chicago, if you look at the redlining map from Chicago, North Avenue is not the border between the desirable and the undesirable areas. But to me, that strikes home even more, right? So in Chicago, the lines between the majority white areas and the kind of upper income areas of the city and the majority minority and immigrant areas of the city, those lines have shifted, those neighborhoods have shifted over time. And so what has happened to the attendance zones, right? The lines have changed, right? The lines reflect the divisions, and they not only reflect those divisions, they reinforce those divisions over time and reinforce the social divisions in the neighborhood. So let's look. Okay, now I want to pull you into my neighborhood. So this is the one I know the most about. So, excuse me. Let me get a drink. All right, so this is my neighborhood, not too far from Altadena. You can see the 2 freeway here and the 110. This is the area between the 2 and the 110 and north of the 5. And so we're a part of Los Angeles Unified School District. The red schoolhouse icon shows Mount Washington Elementary, which is one of the most coveted schools in LA Unified, and definitely one of the most coveted schools on this side of town. So Claire, you can hit play. Let's look at the attendance zone boundary. So here's the attendance zone boundary. And this indeed, I'm not going to show it to you, but this indeed does map very, very closely to the redlining map of the area from the 30s. I mean, you can see it's a weird, misshapen thing. I can only imagine the political shenanigans that went into drawing this particular map. I wonder about that little extended kind of, yeah, that part up there, right? Like how they must have had some powerful folks. So hit pause in just a second, not quite yet. A little further, yeah, okay, there. So here, this shows Mount Washington Elementary with its zone, and that it's surrounded by 7 different elementary schools. Mount Washington is 59% white, and the surrounding schools, the highest percentage of white students is 9%. So my daughter actually goes to Aldama. That is the one with the 9%. That's the yellow school right there. My daughter goes to that school. And all of these surrounding schools, right, they are majority minority schools. And Mount Washington is it's kind of like an island of socioeconomic privilege in this sea of working class people. And the zone, in effect, keeps all of those folks out. The zone is used, if you live on one side of the line, you're automatically in at Mount Washington. If you're on the other side of the line, you can't get in. So hit play. All right, so now hit pause. So what you can see here are the zones for all the other schools, right? The other 7 schools in the neighborhood. Now, I want to make a very important point here, which is that all of those other zones, they are not being used to keep kids out, right? So Los Angeles Unified, like many other schools around the country, has seen declines in enrollment with declining birth rates, some loss of kids to charter schools for sure, but they have seen declining enrollment. And so there are lots of open spaces like Menier Elementary in Chicago, like I think it's PS 307 in Brooklyn. Those are schools that have many, many open seats. So all of these surrounding 7 schools, they have plenty of seats. And so if you live in one zone and you go to them and you say, I want my kid to come to your school, they will accept you, right? Those zone lines don't mean anything for those other schools. The only place the zone lines have any meaning are for Mount Washington Elementary, because Mount Washington Elementary is the school that's full. And so Mount Washington needs a way to keep out, they need to determine who can get in or get out, because they have more demand for seats than there are seats available. And so how do they do that? They are empowered by state law to exclude people based on where they live within the district. Now, one of the reasons I focus on attendance zones in my book is that it gets rid of the taxation issue. So you've all heard about the borders between school districts, right? And those are significant boundaries in our country. And I think there are many policy reasons to get rid of those boundaries as well. But when you look at attendance zones, there are no tax differences, right? When LA Unified issues bonds, right, the people who live in these outside, these outlying schools, they are paying for those bonds, right, that pay for Mount Washington, right? They're paying for it. They're paying for this school that they do not have access to. What was I going to say? I had one other thing I wanted to say. Anyway, hit play, and let's keep looking at this. So now let's look at reading proficiency. So 75% of kids at Mount Washington are proficient in reading. At this school down here, only 16%. Here's a school with only 28% proficient in reading. None of the surrounding schools has more than 54% of the kids proficient in reading, and that's the one across the freeway. So really, there are dramatic differences in student performance across these different schools. So now let's talk about, okay, hit pause again. So now I want to switch and talk about the law a little bit. So one of the biggest surprises when I wrote this book was when I was doing the research for the book was this discovery of a civil rights law from the 1970s that puts constraints on how school districts can assign kids to schools. And this is a law called the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. It was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by a Republican president, so it was a bipartisan effort. And what this law says is that a school district cannot assign a minority child, to a school that is not the nearest to their residence if that assignment would worsen segregation, right? So basically what you've got Congress saying, hey, you can't use these zone lines to keep your schools segregated. And as far as there has been no, the courts have not taken on this issue. There have been no lawsuits around this issue. But if you look at the striped areas, so you can hit play, there are 3 striped areas here. And once they're in, we can hit pause, Claire. All right, you can hit pause. So these 3 areas are areas in which the kids these are areas that are the closest elementary school in each case is Mount Washington Elementary, but the kids in those shaded areas are designated, are assigned to go to other schools. And if they apply to Mount Washington Elementary, they're told, nope, sorry, you're at the back of the line because you don't live within the zone that we've drawn. So the important thing to note here is that any minority child, any minority family living in these striped areas has a right under federal civil rights law to an equal opportunity to get into Mount Washington Elementary. So what we are exploring and what we're hoping some families will do is challenge these lines. It's partly a way to get fair access to these schools. It's also partly a way to raise public awareness of the impact of these lines and how oftentimes people are being assigned to schools that are not the nearest to their house. And those assignment decisions are worsening segregation. They're not just worsening racial segregation, they're worsening socioeconomic segregation, and they're dividing our neighborhoods, is what I see happening. And one final point I want to make is that we looked, I said at the beginning that we were very curious about the legal basis for these distinctions. So when Mount Washington Elementary turns away a kid who lives in one of those shaded areas, how are they doing that? What is the legal basis, the legal foundation for that? Well, it turns out in California, the legal foundation for keeping those kids out is the quote unquote open enrollment law, right? So an open enrollment is designed to allow children to have access to any school within their district, or sometimes if it's cross-district open enrollment, it's designed to let kids have access to schools that they are not assigned to that are even across a district line. But in the case of California's open enrollment law, this was a law that was sponsored by a Democrat again and passed by a Republican. So this was a bipartisan law in 1993. The law provides an exception. It says that any student within a district has a right to go to any school within that district. That's the open enrollment part. But the exception is you cannot displace a child who is zoned to go to that school. So it is in effect the open enrollment law that provides the ability for the district to enforce these geographic enrollment preferences and keep kids out. And so that one exception provides the basis whereby they can keep kids out. Therefore, families cram into the zone. Therefore, prices go up. Therefore, real estate prices go up. Therefore, the divisions in the neighborhood grow over time and the lines become calcified. So with that one exception, you get the full the whole cycle starts, and it's a very hard cycle to end. And the other thing I'll say is I'm very sympathetic. This is a hard message for many families to hear. I certainly have many friends who have bought homes in these attendance zones, and they did not do so out of any ill intent. Right? They were trying to find the best school for their kid. They were using the wealth that they had to try and do right by their kids. I understand that. And so I have sympathy for them. And obviously, if you were to get rid of lines, it would have an impact on property prices. And they would also no longer be guaranteed access at these elite schools. And that is a hard message for a lot of people to hear. But that said, and I'm sympathetic to that, but that said, I don't think that these policies are good for our social compact, and I very strongly believe that ending these geographic enrollment preferences, especially the ones within districts, the attendance zone boundaries, would go a long way to restoring the promise of public education. Because think about it, if you're a family down the hill here in Glassell Park, you probably hear about this elite school that's so good that everybody wants to go to, and you're not allowed to go to that school. And I think that does tremendous damage to our social compact. Claire, and I will say one other thing. I'm sure you guys are going to have some questions about what we think are good solutions to the issue. And I have purposefully been somewhat agnostic about solutions. I think in an ideal world, you would have either the state legislature or Congress or the courts rule that you can't use geography to determine who gets into a school. If they are a constituent of that district, if they are a tax-paying member of that district, you can't use geography to keep them out. What I like about a solution like that is that it frees up experimentation. It provides districts the ability to experiment. So you could have some districts might experiment with a centralized lottery. There have been some districts that have allocated seats based on a centralized lottery. You might have some districts who would go to a system more like a system of school site lotteries, like charter schools use. Indeed, charter schools are forbidden by the state law from using geography to determine whether you get in or not. At least geography of where you live within the district. And so, some districts might experiment with that type of school site system of lotteries, and other districts could experiment with other ways that would provide an equal opportunity. So for example, even like first come, first serve, that's an imperfect system, probably some potential for abuse. But what I like about systems like first come, first serve, or a centralized lottery, or school site lotteries, at least they are built on the principle of equal opportunity. Because right now we have a system that's not even built on the principle of equal opportunity. And so you just get these big divisions emerging over time. So Claire, why don't you put up the last slide? And then I'll turn it over to Gloria for some flavor. So
we want to leave enough time for questions, and I also realized that I left we've completely brushed over the library's statement that they were going to make earlier, because I was very distracted by all the technical side of things, so we just need to leave a little time for that at the end. But let me show it, that last one right here.
Yeah, this is a quick one. So this is another pair of schools, very similar. This is the pair in Seattle. This is John Hay Elementary in the Queen Anne neighborhood. This is Lowell Elementary nearby. And so I did the same thing I did in Chicago. I called up and I talked to a staffer at John Hay, and I said, my family's thinking about moving to Seattle. We're looking for good schools. We keep hearing all this good word about John Hay. How do we get in there? And she said, well, you got to move on the right side of Denny Way, or whatever she said. Get on the right side of the line and you'll be guaranteed to get in. If you're on the wrong side of the line, you're not going to get in. And I played dumb a little bit. And I said to her, well, that doesn't seem fair, right? It doesn't seem fair that I've got to pay a premium, a couple $100,000 extra to live in this area to get access to this public school. And she said, well, yeah, it's not fair, but we have to have boundaries somewhere. Otherwise, no one would want to go to that other school, right? So what she was saying is, I think she was acknowledging something, a truth on the ground, is that if parents had the ability to choose other schools, they likely wouldn't choose to go to schools like Lowell. They likely wouldn't choose to go to schools like Aragon Avenue in our neighborhood. They wouldn't choose to go to Manier Elementary in Chicago. And I think we have a duty, if we're going to repair the social compact, to start thinking about how we open up these good schools in our city centers, how we open them up to the full community, and we make these public schools actually available to the public.
Tim, if I can just jump in and say that some folks might ask, well, wait a minute, these are neighborhood schools. We're going to deconstruct neighborhood schools. That is really not the case. Even thinking about the schools that are most close to where Tim lives, because if you looked at those attendance zones, there were some kids that actually lived closer to the actual school than others who were basically gerrymandered in much farther away. So it's not about this issue of it being a neighborhood school. It's really about how these lines have been drawn, who drew them, and that they really do disenfranchise. Just one other thing to throw out before we go into a conversation is to fight for education reform. It is a beast in Sacramento. There are some very powerful special interests that will fight tooth and nail to prevent any type of reforms. So I really am of the opinion at this point that change, like for the Brown family, 66 years ago, it's going to come through the courts. And I think there is a really interesting alignment now, looking at Supreme Courts, et cetera, that probably the next chapter in the fight for equal access to education is going to be through the courts at this time. It's not going to be through the State House, especially not in California. So I'll stop there.
Okay. I don't know if Marnie has a question or comment that she wants to start with. I know that Dave has posted. I'm apparently the only one who can see the chat messages. I'm sorry. So Dave, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Just
hi, Dave.
Yeah, hi. Very good presentation, Tim.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. I guess it's a general question, but to make it specific to your first example, how did it happen that Lincoln got to be good school and Manier is a crappy school? How does that occur?
Yeah, so I will admit that my book is intentionally agnostic about that question. I mean, that's something that emerged probably decades ago. Lincoln has been a high-performing, coveted school for a very long time, and Manier has been a failing school for a very long time. And so, it's a question that a lot of folks ask, and frankly, just in the context of a book, you have a sort of a limited ability to tackle questions, and I wanted to focus solely on the question of access. So, I mean, you can imagine that some of it has to do with the demographics of people who highly value education and who are educated already are picking that school, and it may have something to do with then teachers. Effective teachers who have choices about where they want to go may choose. It may be easier to teach at that school, and so they may choose to go there. Certainly the parent group at Lincoln is very highly involved. But it's certainly not true to say that the folks at Manier don't want to go to Lincoln, right? I'm sure there are some parents at Manier who would say, no, we want to stay at our school, and we're not. I mean, for one thing, there are probably some very troubled families that go to Manier. Manier serves, the population is very impoverished, and there are some big social problems. But there are Manier parents who want to go to Lincoln, and the other thing I'll say is that if you the black alderman of that area of Chicago, he told a Chicago Tribune reporter, they were walking the streets, and he said, yeah, my black middle-class constituents who live in this neighborhood, they do everything they can to get their kid out of Manier, right? They'll pay extra to go to private school. They'll use consultants to try and get into a choice school. They'll do whatever they can because Manier is a troubled school, and really you wouldn't want to go there unless I think the people who are going there probably don't have a lot of options and don't have a lot of social capital.
Yeah, it's obviously a very complicated dynamic. I guess somebody, if you were thinking about solutions, and I do understand that your book couldn't cover everything, you're presenting the problem, not necessarily all the solutions. But somebody might say, okay, one solution might be a different distribution system than geography to get people into schools. But somebody else might say, well, why can't all the schools be good? Why couldn't the city or the school district allocate resources to build Manier up, and then there wouldn't be this pressure of everybody wanting to go to Lincoln?
Well, I have a couple things to say about that. Number one, I don't think money is the issue, right? And Muneer has been failing for years. Some of these schools, you know, in my neighborhood have been struggling, at least. I don't know if you'd say failing, but struggling for years. And that's been through a period of dramatic increases in per pupil funding. It's been through wave after wave of school reform. And I also think it misreads something about that kind of question. It misreads, there will always be coveted schools, right? It's human nature, right? That people, certain things become trendy, or certain things get on the upswing, and you know, things go through changes. There will always be schools that are coveted where more people want to get in than they have seats. And these are public schools. And so I think you're always going to have the issue of, if this is a public good, if public education is a public good, then how do we address whatever school is in demand at any given point, and has more demand than seats? How do we allocate those seats out? And I think if it's a public good, then you have to make it available on the basis of equal opportunity, if that makes sense. I'm skeptical that, go ahead, Gloria.
I would add in as well, too, that irrespective of how they were drawn, it's really how they are maintained. Because we can certainly see how, quote unquote, good schools are maintained. And you have to really go to taking a look at contracts. Those are essential. Those are critical overall. You know, we are a public sector state. Teachers, quite frankly, are the most powerful political entity in California. If you look at campaign contributions, contribute more than oil, alcohol, tobacco combined. The #1 political force in California are actually teachers' unions. And it's about the contract. It's about, again, to the battle pay. It's about basically the selection of choice. There was a fabulous film a few years ago called Waiting for Superman. I would urge everybody to watch that. You take a look at what we call the dance of the lemons, where you basically can't fire a bad teacher. You cannot fire a bad teacher in California. So what happens then is that the good school gets to, via the contract, send them to the worst school. The whole issue of seniority. The Vergara lawsuit in California, again, to another case just a few years ago, ultimately unsuccessful at the California Supreme Court. But that was one that sought to look at how, you know, these types, the Muneer schools, how they basically are maintained as basically bad schools. The schools that you don't want to go to, but you're forced to because you're told that's your boundary. And I will say, sadly, it's our current US Senator, Senator Kamala Harris, who, as the Attorney General, chose sides with the teachers union to fight back this very important reform that would have begun to bring about changes for kids in California. So I think you have to look at all of those. It is an in-depth battle. And when you start looking at how hard it is to erase these lines, you really are directed to politics and power and money and maintaining status quo that, I'm going to say quite sadly, it works for the adults in the system. It doesn't work for kids and families across, you know, different strata of education throughout the thing. And then finally, I would say, of course, the goal is to have every school. We've got like, what, 10,000 schools, more than 10,000 schools in California. The goal is to have every school because kids can learn. But then that's when you start dissecting it and you find the resource, the most important capital in an education system is really in the teachers. You're going to find night and day. The whole rush to, you know, what, classroom size reduction, as good as that sounds, that was really a fast one that was pulled on the voters of the state of California because suddenly you had a whole strata of teachers suddenly being given emergency credentials, underprepared, untrained, and guess where they went? They went to, you know, they weren't placed in the good schools. They were sent out to basically replicate the non-learning that continues and is maintained in California. So you really have to look at all the laws, teacher tenure, training, how you fire, how you displace, how you even get into a school that's provided and protected by the union contracts. And for the record, I'm actually a member of that union, so I know well what's in those contracts. But it's a really hairy story.
So I have a question. If there's no one else, if anyone else has a question, please feel free to speak up, unmute yourself and speak up.
Oh, I have a question. This is Terry. Can you hear me, Claire?
Hey, Terry. I can hear you.
Hi.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Might be a silly question, but I'm using your district as an example in Mount Washington. You showed the popular school, and then you have all of the other schools around it that are performing at a lower level. But my hunch is that all of the parents are paying the same tax basis to keep that local school district, to pay for it. And yet there's this huge disparity in testing and results and so on. And have there been ways that has the state looked at ways to incentivize good teachers to go to lower performing schools so that they can start to pick those people up by the bootstraps, for lack of a better term, and make that a better performing school?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think the Gloria may know more about this, but the unions really believe in paying for positions, right? So they want to keep the salary the same at different positions at different schools, and certainly one way to draw kids into, or draw good teachers into those poor performing schools would be to provide some bonuses and things like that. And right now, I don't think that's, there may be small programs on the margin that I'm not aware of, but it's not a big part of teacher pay.
Exactly. There's the whole the salary schedule. Interestingly, some years before I left the legislature, I actually it had to be a pilot because this was fought by the teachers union to basically identify simply as a pilot. There was a limited number of schools. I said, let's test this out to provide for, quote unquote, battle pay to get some of the most proficient high. And of course, remember in California, we don't even allow for the tying of teacher performance to student outcomes, which would have been part of the Vergara case. So it's hard to even get a dashboard on performance. That's how blind we fly in education. But I tried to get this through. At the very end, the then president, A.J. Duffy, now passed away, of the United Teachers of Los Angeles, actually said, okay, Gloria, we can do this. Had he not done that, it would have been like just dead in the legislature, because teachers, the union is basically the gateway by which you get something to the governor or not, quite frankly. But even still, it was a pilot program. But exactly what you say, well, let's start putting it on the books, because most of the research on teacher efficacy and student learning clearly shows it's not about dumb kids. I mean, by that matter, I was a dumb kid. My mother had a 6th grade level of education. So it's not about where you live or what kind of a school you've been trapped in. It really is looking at the quality of instruction and being able to get into classrooms where you can really gravitate and be seated for knowledge. So yes, something like that. But California law right now, it's just not there.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question, if I may. And I was wondering, how does this seem to work for star athletes at the high school level? Does redlining in any way inhibit their ability to go to a better or a nominally better school or a different school than their home school?
So that's not an issue that I know a lot about, but my read is that if a family or a student is in demand, then usually these schools have ways to get around these laws. And I will. The other thing I'll say is that in my book I really focused on elementary schools, right? And so you don't have the athlete question in elementary schools. That's more of a high school question. I'm most troubled by what goes on in the elementary schools, where kids get sorted into winners and losers based on where they live, based on it could be a few yards. You live on one side of the street or the other, and you're 5 and you're designated to go to this school that gets you on a route to be successful in school, which puts you on a path to be successful in high school and college and beyond, or you're assigned to a school that is really failing. So, Gloria, do you know anything about the athlete issue?
No, I don't.
I imagine I imagine you have some anecdotes in your head, Marnie. I imagine you know a little bit about this.
Well, no, I've just seen some things having, I grew up in Pasadena, and I've seen a couple of star athletes get passed through the schools and, what do they call that, age grade promotion, and end up at colleges where they were not prepared to deal with the academic requirements of the school. I was wondering if you saw that happening earlier, like when they were growing up.
I haven't heard anecdotes like, I've heard anecdotes like that, and I certainly, if I had a kid who was a star athlete, I would be very, very wary, right? You have to be very careful with kids who have value to adults, right? Because they may do what's right for them and their institutions rather than what is right for that kid or that child. And I suspect that many, especially African-American boys, are used by and I'm a huge sports fan, right? I'm a huge sports fan, but you can't help but be troubled by what appears to happen in some cases. Now, many of those kids use their skills and leverage them to get a great education and to do great things in the world and become productive citizens. So, but if I was a family with a kid like that, I'd be very wary about which adults and which institutions I put the kid in touch with, because the difference in outcomes of whether those folks have your kid's best interests at heart or whether they're just using his academic or his athletic talents, I think is, you have to be careful about that. And frankly, I'll say, it happens on academic talent too, right? Minority kids with strong academics, right, are very much valued by the institutions that want to increase the diversity of the institution. And that's wonderful if they are also doing right by those kids once they're there. And I'm not sure that all those institutions are. And I'd be asking very, very tough questions about dropout rates if I had a talented kid. Well, I will be asking those about my own kids, but I think especially for lower income minority families, just being very careful about which institutions you hand your kids over to.
We have a question from Barbara Hunt. I think we'll take this question and then we will ask Nikki and Stella to give us the update that they have been patiently waiting to give me an hour because I screwed up. So go ahead,
I want a question too, Claire.
Okay. Well,
we can be quick. We can be quick.
Okay. Well, I don't want you guys to rush, but I want to just give Nikki and Stella a chance to speak. So maybe we can come back to questions. But Barbara, go ahead with your question first. We can't hear you, Barbara. Are you muted?
Are you? Oh, there you are. Hi, Barbara.
Actually,
okay. All right, you can hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to know, since this is being recorded, is it possible, or do I need special permission to refer others so I can share this whole session, particularly your comments, Tim? And that would be with either an individual or an institution.
Yeah, I have no problem with it. Claire, you'll have to let Barbara know. I don't know if you're going to post the recording somewhere, but I don't think Gloria and I have a problem. We've been speaking out publicly on these issues. We're very open about these issues.
Okay, because I'm a graduate of Cal State LA and I have an EDD, so I'm very much interested, you know, in the subject, and I would really like some of my colleagues to at least just hear what you're saying and, you know, maybe read your book and things like that. So if you let me know how I can do it, that'd be fine.
I think we can put this recording on. Nikki, perhaps you could step in. Like, we can put this recording edited down on the library's YouTube page. Is that right?
Hey Claire, sorry, I'm outside. You can definitely post it on the library's YouTube pages.
We can't hear you too well.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay, well, actually, why don't we take Joy's question first, and then we'll come back to you.
I do want to say, in response to Barbara, there are all those videos are posted to our Vimeo channel. It's Red Tail Press, the Vimeo channel, and I also have a YouTube channel under my personal name, I believe, that has the redlining animation and the EEOA, the civil rights law, that animation, and our book trailer. So those are good places to start too.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
A great question.
All right, sorry Claire, I was outside. It was really windy.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, we definitely could post it on our YouTube page as well, for sure. I think we should post this on there definitely anyway. Do you want me to just say a few words quick?
Thank you. And again, thank you so much. I feel really dumb. I was so preoccupied with the technical issues that I completely forgot that you said you.
No problem at all. I was definitely, I was glad to listen. Wow, I mean, really, Tim and Gloria, thank you so much for an eye-opening and impactful presentation, and for your work on equity and inclusion, which is very much at top of mind right now. Libraries strive to be a place in the community that is open to all and help build bridges to make sure people have equal access to all. So I'm like so happy to have seen this as a presentation right now. I think it's very timely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, Marnie, and all of the Friends of the Altadena Libraries for all of your support, dedication, and hard work throughout the year. We would absolutely not be the Altadena Libraries that the community knows and loves without all of the financial and volunteer support that the Friends of the Altadena Libraries have offered to us for over 60 years. I've really enjoyed getting to know each of you these first 7 months of being in this role as the district director. Some of you in a virtual capacity, actually, due to the closure since mid-March. I know this is going to be an interesting and challenging year with social distancing and being mindful of how to take donations in a safe and healthy way. I promise to do everything I can to support the Friends' efforts, and I'm hopeful that we will get ourselves back to as normal as we can moving forward. Again, thank you so much for this wonderful donation this year, and for your endless hours of volunteering and dedication to the Altadena Library District. I'm now going to pass the mic virtually to our Public Services Director, Stella Terrassa, to talk a little bit about what, although it's very unpredictable in this next year, the $28,000 that is being given to us is going to be spent on in this upcoming fiscal year. So again, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate everything you do.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nikki. So again, I also just really want to give a heartfelt thank you to all of you for supporting the library and supplementing our operating budget so that we can then reach out to the community in many exciting ways. Because we still don't know what county guidelines are going to be regarding, people in the buildings, whether we can have programs with people attending. We're still kind of looking at planning more virtual programs. So to that end, we do thank the Friends for your support for this next fiscal year for our programming. Traditionally, we've used some of your funding for our Second Saturday concerts, which, as you know, are hugely successful. At this point in time, we're not sure what Second Saturdays will look like. We're not sure if we'll need to divert that funding into some other type of programming, maybe some other virtual programming. But again, we appreciate your support for that. We appreciate the support for this coming year for our newsletter. Certainly, if we're continuing to be in this virtual world, that is hugely important that we're able to still communicate with the public. We did ask for a decrease in funding for our literacy ESL services. And part of that, again, is related to the current pandemic. that we're having Diana, who's our branch manager and who runs our literacy program, she's having to look at other ways to reach out to literacy volunteers and learners. And so we did decrease our request in that way because, again, we're just not sure what that picture is going to look like in this coming fiscal year. We did request some funding for parenting workshops. And so we're very grateful for that. And that also, those parenting workshops, some of you know that we're involved in something called Growing Together Pasadena. It's been an initiative that started this last year, and it's related to early literacy. And so these parenting workshops that the Friends of the Library help support also kind of dovetails with us providing early literacy and just making sure that families are well and healthy. This past year, we started Redlining, and we're very excited that you're able to support that for this next fiscal year. We don't know yet what book will be our choice. This year it's Wild LA. And again, this is our initiative, one book that all the community reads. So we're greatly excited that we'll be able to continue that programming thanks to your support this next fiscal year. And always the ever popular Poetry and Cookies. I was happy to attend the event that you had a month or so ago. And I hope that maybe next year, by that point, we could go back to an in-person situation, but we'll see. Also, this past year, we had Christmas Tree Lane was the first time that they lighted up our parking lot with some of the trees, the deodoras that we have in our parking lot. And we're grateful that you are going to fund us to help continue that effort. And in terms of that brings a lot of volunteers together to help bring the lights and just to be able to provide like a party atmosphere while we're putting the tree lights up. So that's just some of the things that we're hoping to utilize with your support. And so again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stella, and thank you, Nikki. And I think I say on behalf of everyone, we really appreciate everything the library, I said it at the beginning, we so appreciate everything the library has done during this time in particular, but always. And, you know, the courage that you guys will show by going out there and helping to open things up and helping to provide the curbside pickup service, as you are doing right now, in charge of that. And you know, it really is appreciated by everyone. And I think we all agree on that.
And if I could just share one thing, I did have to leave the meeting earlier. Sorry about that, but it was for a very good reason. Today is our very first day of summer reading, and we've been distributing summer reading kits. And it's quite possible that we'll run out of kits today. So that's a lovely, awesome problem to have. So we've had resounding success with that today.
That's fantastic.
What are the summer reading kits?
So we have kits for different age groups. Each age group, from early literacy, pre-K, teens to adults, each age group has a book that is geared towards that summer reading theme. This year, the summer reading theme is Imagine Your Story. And then for each age group, then we'll have programming throughout the summer, again, virtually, that is geared towards that particular age group and relates to the book that we've distributed. So today we had our first program, which is The Magician. I did not get to sit in on the program, but I'm sure children really love that because that's usually a very popular program here in the library.
Thank you.
So great. So thank you again for apologies again for my goof at the beginning. Oh dear, I don't know where my brain was, but and thank you. I'm glad you could come back. So I know we still had a few questions about the speaker for the speakers. So Joy, did you have a question? I heard a voice, and I'm not sure who the voice came from.
No, yes, it was me. I have one that's sort of a comment, half question, and then I have a question. But first, I read the book, and I thought it was shocking. I thought it was wonderful, and I highly recommend everyone to read that. So thank you so much for doing that, and thank you, Gloria, for all of the work that you have done, and I hope you both continue. And the one sort of comment I have is that I know that there will be schools always that are more popular and that parents will want their children to attend. When we first moved to Southern California, we moved to La Cañada for just that reason, because 92% of the graduates go on to university or college. But if the attendance zone lines were removed, don't you think that one of the ultimate effects of that would be to raise the level at all schools? Because clearly there aren't enough spaces in these very good schools for everyone to attend. So there are always going to have to be students who attend the other schools. And if attendance were based on a lottery rather than an attendance boundary, don't you think that that would ultimately raise the level of education at all of the schools? And that's one question. The other one is, are there any cases currently that are dealing with this issue? And how could we find out, or do you know a source that monitors cases that are challenging attendance zones?
So a couple things. So first of all, I don't know of any existing cases. Gloria and I have talked about it, and we've talked to various lawyers over the years. And so we may be involved in some of that. I published a piece about the legal issues in the journal Education Next just a couple weeks ago. So the word about some of the potential of these legal strategies is just starting to get out there. And so, I'm very curious to see what kind of response we get from that. As for your first question is my favorite question, because a lot of people say, well, DeRoche doesn't understand, the schools aren't, this isn't a zero-sum game. We need to make all schools better. I completely agree with that. And I think you're onto something, Joy. I believe if it was more of if people were choosing their own schools and there was a lottery to get into these coveted schools, my belief is that it would improve all schools. And I have a couple reasons to think that. One would be those healthcare clinics, right? You look at those healthcare clinics on the two sides of the line in Chicago that are both performing at about the same level and serve a mixed demographic instead of an isolated demographic. And then I would also say, I've read some economic research about shoppers, about selective shoppers. So for example, I don't look at prices of apples in the grocery store, right? But I benefit from the people who do compare the prices of apples in the grocery store, right? The grocery store, because everyone's shopping all over, the grocery stores know that they can't price their apples at 20% more per pound than the one down the street. Not because I would never notice that. I frankly would never notice if my grocery store charged 20 cents more per apple. But there are some people in the community who are price shopping, and we all benefit from those very selective shoppers. And right now, all of our selective shoppers for schools, or at least a big portion of them, people with social capital, are all concentrating, using their wealth to concentrate in these little cloistered schools. And I think we would all benefit if those people were more broadly spread out. I think those people would argue for more choices for more children. One of the things I see in our neighborhood is people buy a home up on the hill to get into Mount Washington, and they favor keeping other kids out of that school. And then they say, well, we don't need charter schools. Everybody should just go to their neighborhood school like us. Well, if those people were in the same boat that the whole rest of the community is in, if they didn't have guaranteed access to that privileged school because of their wealth, then I think they would be much more likely to say, hey, I want other options. I want choices. I want to be able to pick the right school for my kid. And I think that would have beneficial impacts for all of us. And I want those folks. I want to be shopping for schools with those people, right? I want to benefit from their selectivity, if that makes sense.
If I can add to that as well, I think there has been innovation. People are trying to think outside geography. And some have worked better than others. Some are more limited than others. But for example, charter schools. Charter schools are not the answer, I don't believe, but it is one tool in the toolbox overall. And it is, basically in defiance of geography. And many studies do indicate that, a high quality charter school in a community will basically, lift all boats. You also have some school districts, LA Unified, that does magnet schools essentially. So it still is a district run school, but it's intended to, like as a magnet, attract whether it's a particular issue or certification, that defies geography. LA Unified has also tried something. They played around with this concept of open enrollment, which I strongly do advocate. Although I like a very open enrollment, LA Unified has started to explore this by having quadrants. So basically, if you live within one area of LA Unified, you're no longer tracked, and I'm going to say tracked, to your neighborhood school, quote unquote, but rather you can choose within that limited quadrant. There's also something that all of us know about inter-district transfers, where you can go from LA Unified to, let's say, Pasadena Unified. A lot of issues there because, as we know, this is where you find districts fighting each other when I think they should be collaborating, because the money basically, some districts will say, well, if you take my kid, I lose the money. Kids belong to their parents. They don't belong to districts, but that's how we monetize, kids. So we have all of these issues. And then I think coming out of this pandemic, I actually think we're going to see something growing throughout the nation, and that's homeschooling. That's the ultimate in defying geography. And so I think there's going to be a lot of areas, but I think the point is that none of us would say you have to stop all of that. All of them are forms to combat these very fine lines that really do not serve an equitable purpose. They can be refined, they can be tried. San Francisco had a very interesting open enrollment experiment going on. I'm not sure what the status of it is now, but I would go back to it. Remember, nowhere else in education, from preschool, child care, preschool, and beyond, private schools, you can pick your private school if you have the money. You're not limited to the private school that's in your neighborhood. So the only area in modern life where we really use these boundaries is in K through 12. And we have to ask ourselves why. Churches, shopping centers, malls, parks, all of the gamut. We don't use zip code except for K through 12. And that's the part where I think that's a remnant of a past that really needs change.
And the sad thing is that there are so many children that are attending those underperforming schools who could do so much better. We as a society are losing a lot by not providing the best education we can.
It's true.
So I wanted to mention, I just posted in chat, if anyone is interested in purchasing a signed copy of this book or Tim's previous book, The Ballad of Huck and Miguel, you can contact him, and we'll also send out details by email to all of you, because all of you are registered for the meeting. Are there any other questions?
I just want to say, sorry.
I was just going to say, I have both of your books.
Oh, cool.
Yes. This one was not from Pasadena, but from my own private little book club.
That's awesome. I love to hear that.
And so how, were you saying, Claire, how we could ultimately get these signed? I think that would be wonderful.
Yes, I was saying that Tim has kindly agreed to deliver the signed books, presumably in some bulk, not individually, to the Altadena Library at some point, I guess, when you've gathered a number of orders, and then people will be able to pick them up via the curbside pickup service.
Well, and Joy, if you have books that you already bought and you want me to sign them somehow, we can figure that out once the pandemic passes. I'm happy to do that. And the other thing I'll say is I'll make sure any books that you guys buy, I'll make sure that we get Gloria to sign those as well. So they will be signed by both me and Gloria.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
That sounds fantastic. That's so great. I think my question that I had was asked, or I had some questions. They all got asked by other people at some point. One of the things I was going to ask was about whether you knew about any current court battles, and I think it sounded from the book that you feel like the legislative option, and you already said that in your talk, but you think the legislative option for changing this is just a non-starter because of the groups that have, you know, influence and just it's so hard. It's already kind of been tried and it's failed.
Well, what I would say is that this is a national problem, and one of the great things about our system is that we have a distributed, you know, there are many, many states, and there are many ways that folks could experiment with ways to loosen these restrictions. And so in some states, the environment may be different, and there may be an appetite for getting rid of some of these zones and for trying different things. As Gloria has pointed out many times, the California community college system used to be based on strict geographic enrollment preferences, and they were seeing declines in enrollment in the 80s. And so the legislature passed a law that said, we think California should have the right to choose which community college they go to. Everyone gets an equal opportunity to apply to community colleges, and they did that as a way to draw students back into the system. And I think as some of our K-12 systems struggle with enrollment, some states may start looking at ways to, you know, looking at this as a way to draw people back in, because you can basically have more specialization. And I think some folks who are leaving the system now might come back if they had access to the schools they wanted.
And on that note, I would like to add that, you know, we had spoken ahead of time, just getting ready for this this great meeting today. I pointed out that there are some real strong education leaders, and I would say reformers, here in the San Gabriel Valley. Former Senator Jack Scott, of course, he headed up Pasadena City College. He was my chair when I was a member of the committee. He always supported all the crazy education reform laws that I was trying to pass. Valuable resource. Former Senator as well, Carol Liu, La Cañada Flintridge, again too. Current Senator Anthony Portantino is a voice in education. There's a lot of, again, to well-known educators. I think it would be really interesting to maybe think about a panel, and although Tim, you didn't talk about it extensively, it is briefly mentioned in the book. There's a historic case that deals with equitable access to education, the Jackson case that involves students in the Pasadena School District here in the San Gabriel Valley. So it might be something to continue the conversation going, and maybe tapping in with some of the legislators as well, former legislators, and Senator Scott could also talk about the community college option, because later he was appointed as the chancellor of the California community colleges before he ultimately did retire. So there's a lot of, I think, expertise, and it could be a really interesting sort of think tank as far as looking at how do we go forward. Because certainly, Tim's point in writing the book was not just to write the book, but really as a calling card for action. We are looking for, who's going to be the little Linda Brown? Who is going to be the next one to really fight for this, going back into a courthouse once again? And that's where Tim and I would love to continue talking with anybody who's interested in finding those options and opportunities, because we have to be the eternal optimist to really continue to believe that education is the key to the American dream. We just want to make sure that it is really accessible for really anybody who desires it.
And I think in keeping with, as I said earlier, our desire to help the library, support the library anyway, and the whole community in ways to have these kinds of conversations and to have more speaker meetings and more panel events and more community discussions, about some of these issues, I think that would be really great. And maybe it's something, as we said earlier, that the Pasadena Library and the Altadena Library, who are already coordinating on some great programs, could put this sort of thing together, because I think there's a lot of people from different groups who would be great to be on a panel, as well as the people you just mentioned. So that sounds really great. I was just going, I should ask if there are any other questions. I haven't seen any other questions posted in chat, but people should feel free to speak up if they have one last one.
Well, since you asked, this is Jeanette. I'm going to ask about, I was just getting to the part in the book where they were talking about gifted programs and other ways that people use to get out of the district they're in or the school that they're assigned to, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. I guess I should ask also, are the gifted programs in the different school areas equivalent? And Tim, you're still muted.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Thanks for the question, Jeanette. Yeah, it's one of the, in the book, I sort of divide folks into three groups. So there are the address pickers, people who select a school. They select a place to live based on the school in that area. And then there are the school shoppers. And these are folks who probably don't live in one of these elite zones, but they go out and they use other programs like gifted and talented programs or magnet programs, as Gloria said, or charter schools or private schools even. These are folks who are looking for the right school for their kids across a broad spectrum. And then finally, there's just the passive folks who just kind of go, they don't pick where they live based on the schools, but that they just send their kids to wherever they're told. So the gifted and talented one is a big one. And, the big issue nationwide is that, white and Asian kids are much more likely to be assigned to gifted and talented programs than are African American and Hispanic kids. And so you just have to be careful. They've shown that for a given level of achievement, that an African American kid is half as likely to be deemed, to be designated as gifted and talented as a white kid of the same achievement level. So you got to be very careful about that now. But I think that probably varies quite a bit from district to district. So some of those programs are probably great. The other thing I'll also say is that there's a lot of evidence that African American teachers are better at finding those gifted and talented African American kids than are white teachers, right? The track record, the percentages, and certainly you don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but if you look at the statistics, white teachers just designate African American students for those programs at a much lower rate than do African American teachers, and so I would worry about that. If I had a kid that was African American, I would just be very attentive to that. And those programs, I mean, our daughter applied for a gifted and talented program because we're in the school shopper category. We're trying to figure out what the right option is because we live just outside one of the zones. And she's a talented kid. She did not meet the criteria, whatever those criteria were for a 5-year-old. And those are government programs. I'm skeptical, right? I'm always skeptical of what some bureaucrats deciding about which kid is talented and which isn't. Like, who knows? Like, they could have good intentions and it could be a well-designed criteria list, or maybe not. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
Partially in alternative schools, do you know about the alternative school programs also? Or?
I don't know very much about them. I know that there are, I know of them, but I don't know very much about them. And the quality probably varies quite a bit. I mean, one of my messages from the book is, and my sister is an educator and has worked in urban public schools for 20 years. No family of any income level, of any race, should be passive about where their kid goes to school. And there's no way, there are no broad patterns, right? There are charter schools that are wonderful, wonderful, amazing schools. And there are charter schools that aren't very good. There are traditional district schools that are quite good schools. And there are district schools that are failing kids. And that you wouldn't want your kid to be in. And you really don't know that until you go visit the school. And part of the message of my book is, you know, over 50% of the American public are in that passive group, right? The passive group that just sends their kids to whatever school they're assigned to. And I'd argue, and there are a lot of wealthy people in that group. There are a lot of people who live in the suburbs. There are people who live in the inner cities in that group. I think all of us should be taking a close look and thinking very carefully about what are the needs of my kid, you know, and each kid really has to be regarded separately. I don't think you can make that choice for all your kids at one time. I think you have to think about each kid. Now, hopefully as a parent, you hope they end up in the same school and that the same school is the right fit, and you hope that it's right down the street. But certainly I don't think it's right for our society where parents just turn that decision over to the government. I think we should all be thinking very, very carefully about what are our kids' needs, which school will they thrive in, what school will be best for them. And I think alternative schools are one option, but I think you've got to look at the individual school to know what's really going on, if that makes sense.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeanette.
I was just going to comment that there's so much to think about in this book, and what you have both been saying. There's a lot to analyze and consider when you think about what contributes to this redlining and what contributes to children's education. And I'm just wondering if you want parents, or not even parents, just the regular citizen, because I don't have any children, I'm not going to have any children, even though I'm 2 doors away from a school. What do we as the public do to assure that all children get a more equal education, a higher level education? Who do we vote for, or how do we get into that system to be able to choose who it is that's drawing those lines? How do we find out who's drawing the lines, and how do we influence positively the way that those lines are drawn?
Yeah, I think one of the things, Gloria can speak to this, I think you can't vote on partisan lines because there are, on this issue in particular, there are Democrats who are great, there are Republicans who are great, there are Democrats who will simply vote their selfish interest based on the interest groups who are paying into their election campaigns, and there are Republicans who will do the same thing. You can't, this issue in particular cuts across partisan lines. Gloria is a great example of a hero on the left who has fought for these battles, and a recent bill came out from Senator Mike Morrell. He's a Republican out in Rancho Cucamonga, trying to open up more cross-district open enrollment so that kids can cross district lines more freely. And so, you know, you really have to pay attention to what each person is saying and whether or not they are willing to go against the adult interest groups, I think, that are pushing on them, and whether they're willing to be open-minded, and whether they, and I think also whether they see the issue through the lens of, you know, should kids, you know, there is a group of folks in our society who think kids should be assigned to schools, and some of them are well-intentioned, but I don't think that's going to solve, it's going to be problematic for our country if we keep going down that route. We don't do that in any other area of our life. And so I think folks who are willing to see beyond that simple lens, I think, is an important thing to look for. Gloria?
And I agree with everything that Tim has said. I think also, too, taking a look at the local level, we all have school boards. Even charter schools have board of directors. But I think it would be interesting if you take a look at even election statistics. It's something like maybe 10% voters vote in a local school board election. They are really, really very low participation. So basically, politicized status quo interests are the ones who carry in the candidates of their choice. It might be interesting to start talking to your local school board members, asking them about, hey, what about the attendance zones? Because I would submit to you, they probably don't know. Maybe it's a way to find out from the local bureaucrat, hey, who drew these lines? How did they come to fruition? We see a lot of transition of school superintendents. Do they know about this? And so it might be even an interesting conversation to start inviting or talking with your local school board members, because probably they have no idea either about these fine lines that Tim has exposed in this book. There's just so much to be done. But the bottom line is that the power of this book, I think, again, to do my little commercial here, I have it again. The power of this
Thank
book,
you, Gloria.
it really should be an aha moment. That really, this is something, these boundaries, lines are really strong determinants of how kids get trapped and have been trapped and will continue to get trapped unless there is some action. So, I would just say there's so many conversations that we can't, whether we have children or not, we all pay the property taxes, we all pay the fees, and we're all going to be asked to vote on measures that sound great, but in my own opinion, it's not about how much money you put in the system. It really is about the reforms that come out of it. How is that money used rather than how much more is put into funding public education in California?
What struck me in the book very much was the school, and I think Philadelphia, that was this innovative school linked to the university. Is that the one?
Yeah, the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, and it was so striking because it was this case where people were obviously trying to do the right thing. The legislature or the school or the state or whatever were trying to do a great thing, and they were trying to put a really good school into an area that was, I think, majority African American, right, and relatively low income, and it had failing schools there before, and so they put this wonderful school in, and within, I know I shouldn't be saying this, you should be saying it because I remember it, but you can see, you can test me how much I remember the book.
You're getting it right, yeah.
Within like 13 years, the house prices had nearly doubled because all these people were pulling into that school attendance zone because they wanted their students to go to this wonderful school. So people who lived there originally were being pushed out. Because the rents were going up and the house prices were going up, and it was unsustainable for them to live there. And to me, that was saying, even if you try and fix the problems that are, if people are trying to fix this problem in a very, very tangible way, and you're actually, in this case, the attendance zone was producing a disparity that didn't exist before. It was changing in effect where the redlining would be, and that, to me, that was the kind of.
And it disrupted that working class community, right? That there was a working class community there, and communities sometimes disrupted, right? Things change, and things that we care about aren't always going to last forever. But when you create a school and you create an attendance zone, and it's a coveted school, and then all of these people rush in to buy houses, and it ends up pushing other people out, that that might have happened anyway for other reasons, but it shouldn't happen because of government policy. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
Well, Claire went right to the example I was thinking about too, that it shows that people within the community can do something to change how the school is operated and lift it up. But then that does happen where, because the school is lifted up, then the change in the community happens. But here's where I was going with that, is how can we support that school? One of the examples that you gave was the woman who didn't have any children was offering her time voluntarily to help with the music program. I know that's not the focus of your book, but did you see other examples of that elsewhere?
Well, you see at these elite schools, people are very eager to donate, right? It's the troubled schools that are the problem, where they're harder schools to go into. The kids are harder to work with. And so those are the schools where people need to, engage, and they need more parent involvement, and they need more volunteers from the community. These elite schools, like in Mount Washington, I think what you're talking about is, this indie rock, right, icon teaches music up at Mount Washington Elementary, right? And it's just a very different environment at these elite schools where you get lots of high profile people coming in to volunteer. But it's the more troubled schools that need the help. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And we really thank you. We've gone half an hour over our planned time. So thank you very much for staying with us, Tim and Gloria. And thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. We're so honored.
Well,
and it was wonderful.
It was a great conversation, really good questions, and I appreciate it's a tough topic. It's challenging, so I appreciate the depth of the questions and your willingness to hear us out.
Thank you so much. It's been very informative.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Really, really very informative and very inspiring. Yes. And I plan to contact Cal State LA, where I came from, so that they can kind of hear what you're saying, because I think it's very true.
Wonderful, wonderful,
yeah.
Good.
I would like to say the same. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we'll definitely make an edited version on the YouTube channel of the library.
Claire, do you have any final words as president before we?
That's right.
I love you, President. I just to say that I've had a fantastic, amazing, in many ways, unexpected year as president. I love the friends. I could go on for ages about how wonderful the friends are. You guys all know that. My family in the US, and I really appreciate having had the opportunity to be your president for a year. And I'm not going anywhere. Well, I'm 5,000 miles away, but I'm not going anywhere as the friend. I'm staying on this communications guru. And on that note, our next meeting, which will be chaired by Marnie, I believe will be our July board meeting. And we are, as we said earlier, we are planning a book pitch party, which will hopefully draw a even bigger crowd than it did last year, and will be something that can kind of unite us with all kinds of diverse and exciting and thought-provoking stories, while we're still on lockdown and we're still in the virtual world. And then, as I said earlier, I really hope that the library will continue to do more of this kind of programming, and do more speaker meetings and other events to try and have these kinds of important conversations, and that we can support that. So yes, thank you all for coming, and I think that is the end of our meeting. So
all right.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your leadership this year. It's been great.
Thanks.
That it has. Very much so, Claire. We'll miss you, but we still want to see you.
It's not going to be that easy. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you, Tim and Gloria.